Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. welcomes Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. Dr. Brock is a renowned theologian, author, and national expert on moral injury, currently serving as Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Recovery Programs at Volunteers of America. In this role, she leads efforts to advance understanding and healing for individuals and communities affected by moral injury, particularly veterans. She was the founding director of the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University, where she also served as research professor of theology and culture. A prolific scholar and speaker, Dr. Brock is the co-author of Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, and Proverbs of Ashes, Violence, Redemptive Suffering, and the Search for What Saves Us. She has provided training for VA mental health professionals, chaplains, and veteran families. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Loren Richmond Jr., and I'm actually recording live and in person at the Remind and Renew Conference here at Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm pleased to be joined in person by Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom you're sharing at this conference. Take a moment to share anything you'd like our listeners to know about you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I should say that my degree is in theology, philosophy, religion, and theology. And I've been interested in the progressive end of Christian theology and movements for social change for all of my adult life. I started college in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, right. What is... Share a little bit, if you're willing, more about your kind of faith background and journey, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Okay. I was born in Fukuoka, Japan, to a Puerto Rican birth father that I didn't know I had or meet till I was 33. So I was raised for the first 5 years of my life in my grandparents' home with my mother, and my grandfather was a Buddhist priest. So I was raised a Buddhist in Japan for 5 years. And then I transitioned for a year in Okinawa at a military base. My stepfather, by that time, had married my mother, and he was in the U.S. Army. So I landed in Fort Riley, Kansas at the age of 6 and transitioned to military life. Grew up military dependent. So I went to military schools and to chapel Protestant services. My stepfather was from Amory, Mississippi, so he was a Southern Protestant, and so we went to Protestant services, and in the military, chaplains are not allowed to proselytize. Mm-hmm. So I was never asked about baptism or anything, but I did attend Sunday school, and I remember in about 5th grade or so, the teacher said something about we should read the Bible cover to cover, so I did.
Wow.
And a lot of it didn't make any sense to me, but all the things I was being told about Jesus as this kind and nice savior did not comport with the confrontational, argumentative person I saw in the New Testament. And as a Japanese person, that kind of behavior is very antisocial. So I didn't really understand Christianity exactly. I knew what it was saying and claiming, but it didn't interest me actually that much. I did do youth things and stuff with the chapel programs because that was expected. And I think I even learned to sound like a Christian, but it wasn't clear to me exactly what that meant. And I really did not want to align myself with anything that would prohibit me from being reunited with my Japanese grandparents. And I all those years, I was subjected to racism because it was in the 50s after World War II. And so I kept wanting to go home. And for me, home was Japan. But I didn't speak the language anymore. And I remember as a kid wanting my mother to reteach me Japanese, and she was always too busy. She wouldn't do it. And I didn't realize until much later that the reason she didn't do it, I think, had to do with my birth father and all kinds of things she didn't want me to know. So I grew up in the U.S. military, but when I was 16, my father went to Vietnam for 2 years on 2 tours, and I had a friend in high school whose father was a Baptist minister, and so she invited me to church one day, and this was a fundamentalist conservative Baptist church, and I believed in evolution and other things like that. But her father was just a good minister. And so he actually, I think, sort of took over helping my family because my dad was gone for 2 years. So I sort of was semi-adopted into, like whenever they would take trips, my friend would invite me to go with them. So I was going to the beach and surfing in the summertime and doing a lot of fun stuff with his family and attending his church. And at some point in that process, pretty early, I realized that to be sort of fully inside that circle of care that he had, I should join the church. So I asked him to baptize me, and when he asked me if I believed that Jesus Christ was my personal Lord and Savior, I said yes, even though I had no idea what that meant. I mean, I did, but I didn't. I didn't believe it in the sense of me going to heaven and my grandparents going to hell. And so, but really, the reason I got baptized was so I could be a full-fledged member of his church in particular, because he was such a great minister. And he knew I believed in evolution, and he baptized me anyway. For a fundamentalist, that was kind of made. But he was like that. He was in trouble with some of the other ministers in his conservative denomination because he allowed Alcoholics Anonymous to use the church for meetings, and they were really upset. They disagreed with that because you need to require people to be saved first before they can use the church. And his reply was, well, until they get sober, they can't get saved. So so he was just very compassionate and sensible that way. And he was a really good minister to me and my family. So I got baptized a Baptist. But when I went to college, I stopped going to church because I tried one Baptist church in the town of Orange, and it freaked me out. It was so weird. So I stopped going to church, but I went to Chapman, now University. It was Chapman College at the time, which is related to the Disciples, which is Phillips Seminary denomination also. And I got him. I was actually pre-med. I had high grades in math and science. I was going to be a brain surgeon. That was my goal, was to become a surgeon of some kind. And but the civil rights movement broke out my first semester in college in a really dramatic way on campus, and it was really clear you had to step up. And so I got immediately involved in activist civil rights work because it made a big difference. And so that made my science classes seem really boring. I just lost interest in the science and math, and I got more interested in the civil rights movement. And I had a scholarship from the state of California for tuition for 4 years. And I was close to losing it because I was so bored of my science classes. And I asked some of the student leaders in the civil rights movement what I could take that was interesting. And I thought they might send me to political science or something. No, they sent me to all of them that I asked, 3 people I asked. They were all juniors and seniors. And I said, what can I take? And they said, take Willis Fisher's Old Testament class. It'll be the hardest and best class you take in college.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm like, why Bible? That's so weird, right? And I couldn't figure that one out, especially as a Baptist who was a lapsed Baptist, as it were. But I, 3 people said it. So I signed up for it the first semester of my sophomore year. And it was the best class I had in college. It was the hardest. I mean, it was taught by a professor who had retired from Claremont Seminary in Old Testament and was in his retirement teaching at this undergraduate college. And he was a really wonderful professor. His lectures were compelling and dazzling, not in a kind of charismatic way, but just because you were just riveted by what he was saying. And then to find out that the Bible wasn't literally true, that there were all these different historical things and all of this stuff you study when you actually dig into the Bible in original language and, all of that, and the history and the archaeology in it and all that. And I was fascinated. So I took every class he taught. And by the end of my sophomore year, I had taken everything. And he called me into his office and he said to me at the end of my sophomore year, what are you majoring in? And I said, well, I'm in pre-med, but I don't really like my science classes. And he said, well, have you thought about religion as a major? I said, no. And he said, well, you made A's in all your classes with me. And I said, yeah, I'm interested. He said, well, you could keep doing that. And he talked me into a religion major. And so I did fine grade wise. But when I'd taken everything he taught, I was bereft because what was I going to, So I actually took another independent study with him at one point to learn biblical Hebrew.
Wow.
So I did my undergraduate work mostly in Bible, but also, to do the major, I had to do all these courses. But I also took biblical Hebrew on the side just because that was a way to stay. I could go in and talk to him about stuff.
Yeah.
So that's how I wound up in religion. And because I was in a religion major, the chaplain's office, which was disciple run, invited me to be part of a student group called the Chaplain's Council. So it was all the religion majors. So I got involved with that, and that's how I found out about the denomination that didn't have creeds and thought you should read the Bible for yourself. I thought I could deal with that, So I wound up a disciple that way. So then I got a job my junior year teaching Sunday school to junior high kids. My senior year. It was my senior year because I only got to do a semester, and then I went on World Camp as a float. But I discovered I loved teaching. I was really good with junior high kids and
That's
Bible.
A skill right there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, in fact, when I went on the ship, they got me a gift box of things to take. I mean, I really love that. So, but somewhere in the end of my junior year, the same professor his name was Willis Fisher. We all called him Dr. Fisher. We were a little reticent to call him Willis. He preferred Willis. He called me in and said, have you thought about graduate school? And I said, no. And he said, well, you really can't do a huge amount with an undergraduate religion major, but if you went and did a master's degree, you could write curriculum for churches, or you could become a minister. I said, no, I'm not becoming a minister.
Yeah.
So he had all these other options if I got a master's degree. And I said, well, I guess I would think about it. He said, well, if you do decide you want to go, we have a grant arrangement with the Lane Foundation where we can recommend you for tuition scholarship if you go to a master's degree. So I finally decided that I didn't have any other better plans with a religion major. And so I wound up with a tuition scholarship to Claremont, to any seminary. And I picked Claremont because all the straight A students went there. Right? So, and I went there and continued to find religion fascinating. And I did a master's. And I was pretty clear ministry was not my calling. So I didn't do a master's of divinity. I did a master's in religion in preparation for. By then, I was pretty sure I wanted to teach it and be a professor. So that's how I wound up getting a doctorate in theology. And I thought it was going to be Bible because he was a biblical studies professor. But in between college and that master's degree in seminary, the feminist movement exploded, and Ms. Magazine published its first edition that summer, and all this stuff. And So by the time I was in graduate school for my master's, the Bible seemed so damned patriarchal that I did not want to spend my time studying it.
Yeah.
I wanted to do theology because Rosemary Ruth or Mary Daly, these feminists were putting this stuff out there. And it was like, oh, yeah, that's what I want to do. So my sort of civil rights activist energies then flipped over into feminist work and religion. I didn't lose the civil rights and anti-racism piece, but I added both the feminist movement and the first Earth Day happened while I was in college. So environmental issues, feminist issues sort of piled on to a whole bunch of other things. So that's how I wound up in religion at all. It took me a long time after I got my doctorate to find a tenure track position because feminists and women of color were like not popular. And so I went from sabbatical replacement to 1-year appointments for a long time in my career. So this is odd, but the first and last job I held as a professor was an endowed chair. I got an endowed chair a year after I finished my doctorate. And that's where I got tenure. And I did that for 7 years. And then I was tired of teaching, so I quit. And I became an administrator for a while and then a sort of independent activist. And then I just, and part of that was anti-war because of the Vietnam thing. And in that process, I discovered this concept, moral injury, which is now just, I'm obsessed with it. So that's how I got here to where I am now at Volunteers of America running moral injury programming. And I've been doing that for 7 years, and I did 5 years at Bright Divinity School doing that also. So I've been working in the moral injury space for almost 15 years.
Yeah. So I imagine a lot of our listeners will be familiar with you from the topic of moral injury. I remember reading your book when I was in seminary here, moral injury, and what was the title?
Soul Repair.
Soul Repair. That's right. I should remember. I remember the cover, right? It's kind of this grayish
isn't
cover.
that a beautiful cover?
Yes.
I love the cover of that book. Yeah.
Usually I have them right in front of me, but because of circumstances, I don't. So here we are. We're recording at Phillips Seminary for the Remind and Renew conference, and the theme of this conference is seeking wisdom and understanding in troubling times.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping we can mix into this conversation your broader work in moral injury. But let's begin with this. Let's just start talking about these troubling times. I've read this in a couple different sources of late, this term polycrisis. Are you familiar with the term? Do you want to define it for our listeners?
Well, it's just where these massive things accumulate and they're all happening simultaneously and they seem overwhelming. That's how I would understand it.
Yeah.
I think the biggest overwhelming one is climate change. It's so big that people try to ignore it.
Yeah.
There's that. There is a hot war in Europe. There's Israel and they supposedly have an accord now, but but Palestine is gone. I mean, now they have an accord now that it's been destroyed, right? So there are wars going on, and a hot war in Europe is very concerning, right? We have nuclear weapons, and then we have, from my perspective, an incompetent government coming in that is. When your commander-in-chief is a convicted sexual assaulter and an adulterer and a bad financial manager, and he wants to put in the head of the Department of Defense somebody worse than that who's also an alcoholic. Same. I mean, they're very similar in that regard to who's never run an organization bigger than 100 employees running the Department of Defense. I mean, this is just that's another layer of polycrisis, and the fires are, this is all climate change.
As we're recording.
Yeah. It's what Naomi Klein called disaster capitalism. The way it works is that it keeps having these polycrises going on to distract people from really what's going on in other places where they want you to look. And so I think that's part of the world we're living in.
I'm glad you mentioned that idea of disaster capitalism, distraction. I'm thinking too, like, I think in a couple of days, supposedly TikTok is or may not go away, which I think we could debate the merits of TikTok, but it certainly I guess a cynical view would be it does serve to somewhat distract us from what's going on, but also obviously there's some.
It's also information about what's going on.
It also is information about what's going on.
Well, this is the other piece of, I think, the polycrisis that's I have no solution for is the collapse of a reliable media.
Yeah.
So information is completely random.
Yeah.
And faux facts are everywhere, and you have to you have to do your own work to figure out what's true and not true, and that's even difficult. But it used to be a few reliable mainstream sources of media information were where people got their information. Now it's everywhere. Social media, email blasts. I mean, it's so there's that, and that process of getting information is not collective. It used to be that there were 3 networks, so you knew that your people at school had watched one of those 3 networks.
Right.
Now it's stuff on phones, it's stuff on cable, it's everywhere. And so there's a sort of saturation point where people are just too overloaded to sort it all out. There was a study once done about, when you in a supermarket, if you have 10 choices of jelly, and then you have 3. If you have 3, people will buy one, but if you have 10, they look at it and walk out because they can't decide, right? And so it's sort of like that with the media.
Yeah.
So I actually myself limit myself to a few places where I'm pretty sure it's reliable information. And then I look at stuff that I'm skeptical of just to see what kind of crap is out there. But it's hard to have a democracy when things are so fragmented that there's almost no consensus about anything.
Yeah. So this topic of seeking wisdom, because I'm thinking about like what you said about the many, many voices and distractions we have from different media sources. I don't know if I didn't watch the movie just because I found it so over the top, but there's the movie Don't Look Up, which, speaking of climate change, like I found it like just too much. I was just like, okay, I get what they're trying to do, but it's too much for me.
But it's like that.
But certainly there's kind of that like that where, there's so much distraction, so much silliness. And I think I feel like that's almost the hardest thing, because it's not that we lack information. Like it's
too much.
There's too much information. How then do we seek wisdom?
Well, I think the thing that's compounding the problem is that these media forms of media are highly individualized.
Yeah.
So we have an epidemic of loneliness and a saturation of too much stuff.
Right.
And there's no there's no wisdom in loneliness. I mean, wisdom comes from experience.
That's good. Yeah.
It comes from being out in the world with others and experiencing problems and figuring out how to solve them and being with others and feeling supported and connected to people. Because what's wisdom for if it's just you having it? Right. It's really to help the world and help others and to make the world a better place. If you can be, as one of my favorite ancient theologians named Ambrose, who was the one that converted Augustine and baptized him. So he's a pretty smart guy.
We have Ambrose to thank for that.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, Augustine's maligned in ways that I think are unfair. But anyway, his favorite name for God was beauty. Anybody that cares that much about beauty, I have sympathy for.
Yeah.
But Ambrose said, people think innocence is a way to protect yourself from bad stuff. But innocence is just basically stupidity. That if you don't know what evil is, you can't avoid it and you might do it yourself. And to learn that means being related to the world and paying attention and looking into what evil is to understand it, because otherwise you're just going to be stupid about it.
Yeah.
And right now we need people who are wise about these things. And as people are more and more isolated, they're not capable of. You cannot engage evil alone. Right. So that for me, that's why having communities and friends and connections that you can rely on and be part of is really, really important. And I know when the pandemic started, a lot of that stuff stopped for people because you were stuck in your apartment or house by yourself or with your dog or something, right? I was with my cat, right?
Yeah.
I got a cat, so I wouldn't be alone.
You and everybody else, right?
Yeah, right. And now I have 3. So, but anyway, and so when that started to happen, then I had friends. We all agreed that we would meet on Zoom, right? So I have 2 regular weekly meetings on Zoom, and that started during the pandemic. But it was so useful and so satisfying that we just keep doing it. Because we don't live in the same place. And before we counted on going on vacations together and seeing each other at events and stuff like that, and we couldn't do that. But now I feel even closer to them because I'm on there every week with them. So there's ways to use the technology that can be helpful, but mostly it's atomizing people.
Yeah.
But you have to be deliberate and intentional about creating community now because so many people are suspicious of institutions and won't invest time and energy in them. So we're also not only losing the connections of just friendship, but also we're institutions where people used to collect and be together.
Why don't we stay on this term of the decline of institutions? Certainly, we're here in an institution talking about a broader institution, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. There was just released on social media this week data about the decline of our denomination and mainline Protestantism writ large.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about maybe I'm making a connection that isn't there, but I'm thinking about the disconnect people have towards institutionalism, and a lot of it is fair because of the way this is where the connection between moral injury comes, because people have protected the institution at the cost of individuals,
or they're just unjust institutions.
Right.
So the decline of the churches started during Vietnam, and I think there are a couple of major factors involved in that. One is it's not the main one, so I'm going to talk about it in a minute. I think the main problem was that coming out of World War II, the country was built economically around a focus on nuclear families with one breadwinner.
Yep.
And churches were also set up that way. So the ways that churches function was that you had a family with one breadwinner and a bunch of volunteers that keep the church going, right? Who had time.
Right.
So now we have people with 2-parent homes and nuclear
Both
families
working.
with 4 jobs. They're both working 2 jobs. It's the only way to have a middle-class life because of the cost of health care and a whole bunch of other housing and all of that. And that is an economic issue that started with Ronald Reagan. I mean, it was a serious shift of trickle-up economics.
Right.
So we have billionaires and poor people. Right. So, and every administration since Reagan has contributed to the problem. Some of them have tried to stop it in some forms, but basically the momentum of that billionaire juggernaut has driven a huge amount of what's happened now, where college is out of the hands of the middle class, and you need a middle class to have a democracy. And churches can't survive because the only one who has time to do any work is one minister.
Yeah. It really makes sense when you think about where churches are today.
Yeah.
There's either like a bunch of tiny churches that can survive because they're so small, or they're like these corporate behemoth churches who can afford a multi-staff to do everything.
Right. Because of a bunch of people who are willing to give money to them, right? Instead of doing that money for social services, right? Feeding the poor, building senior housing and other things, right? So there's, these are religious empires, right? Yeah. And with all the problems you have with all of that, including sexual abuse by ministers and like Mars Church meltdown, all of that. So, because they are built on a Christianity that's highly authoritarian. So you don't challenge the minister. And so those are, I would say, anti-democratic structures a lot. but they're also having issues because they're losing a lot of their youth to homophobia.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not there's some of these big behemoth churches and empires, but a lot of evangelical churches are not surviving. And I think somebody did a study at one point as there was that big boom in evangelical churches.
Right.
They said, well, nobody's studying the clothes of all the rural churches.
Mm-hmm.
So they look like they're new people coming in, but in fact, there's a lot of drainage of happening at the rural levels because there's no jobs left there. Right. So I think there's fundamentally a major economic issue in North America, in the United States anyway, that is exacerbated by a kind of cruel kind of capitalism that we have.
Mm-hmm.
It's particularly cruel that we don't have universal health care, because that's the biggest factor in bankruptcies.
Yeah.
So but Vietnam was the beginning of the death of institutions, or not the death, but the erosion of trust in institutions because of the war. And in fact, if Johnson hadn't gotten caught and didn't have the courage to end the war, he had a great society plan to end poverty, and it was amazing what he wanted to do as president. He couldn't pay for it because he had to pay for the war, and the war meant he couldn't run for a second term to really implement the kind of society that was sort of an echo of FDR, that would take care of the middle class, and it didn't happen because there was that, and a whole generation of us learned to distrust the government because it lied and got a lot of people killed.
Right.
And I remember the New York Times op-ed about the end of when McNamara wrote his autobiography and said, yeah, it was a big mistake. Sorry about that. The New York Times editorial was just excoriating about it. They won a Pulitzer for it because it was that kind of searing critique with this deep sorrow built into it about what was done to a whole generation by that bad war.
And I feel like we have echoes of that in
Afghanistan
church.
and Iraq.
Certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan.
So we have another institutional thing.
Right, in the church where it's this kind of defend the institution at all costs.
Yeah.
And that cost tends to be the human beings and their soul.
I've been in 2 churches where the minister did sexual impropriety things.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, one of them involved a dean from Phillips that was the minister of my church in Houston.
Oof.
And this was a very long time ago, so I don't think I'm slandering anybody now that's alive, but he, senior minister, very prestigious. The church was really big. There was a very large, young adult, like up to 35 or 40 class. There was like a huge class. We did a lot of social activities. It was just wonderful. And then it began to shrink. And new people that visited didn't come back. Mm-hmm. And then we had sponsors in their 50s. And the woman who was in the couple of that group, accused the minister of trying to rape her in her home.
Oh, man.
And she fought him off.
Yeah.
But she didn't shut up about it.
Yeah.
We found out that as the church investigated, that he would pay these visits to these new couples when the husband wasn't home.
Oh, my gosh.
It was really bad. And so the personnel committee spoke to Phillips about, was there a problem at Phillips?
Mm-hmm.
And he had been the dean here. And yes, there had. And so the personnel committee and the church asked why they weren't warned. And the reply was, we didn't want to ruin a good career. So he ruined I don't know if he ruined the church, but
he ruined some lives.
He ruined a lot of lives. And I don't know, it was part of the decline of Protestantism, so the decline in that church is probably part of a larger trend, but it didn't help that this guy was forced to resign and then took a renegade group and started a church across town of the people who didn't believe the charges or anything. So that was the first time I encountered it. And I actually, my ex-husband and I made an appointment to see him and said, you need therapy. This is really bad what you've been doing. You need therapy. We just decided that that we wanted to do everything we could do. And we thought it was an okay thing to go in and tell him that we believe the charges and that he needed help rather than just shine him on. So, and he actually literally started to shake and said, I'm afraid I can't do that because I would fall off my pedestal. That was my first experience with that. And then there was another instance where the minister was charged with inappropriate behavior in a counseling situation, and he was very popular, very charismatic, and the congregation had to take a vote, and it was close, but he was removed.
Wow.
But it split the church. That church never really quite recovered. It kept going for a few more, it kept going, but some of the key, most enthusiastic members left with him.
I feel like this all ties into this idea of the challenge of seeking wisdom when we think about not only do we have so many disparate voices, but these institutions, these sources of wisdom that historically have been trustworthy places are seen as less and less trustworthy.
Yeah.
Many times deservedly so.
Well, this is, ministers are human beings and they're just as flawed as any other human being. Right. But the sort of aura that attends to their authority to speak the word and all that is actually probably not an ancient church practice. There's a pilgrim diary from a woman named Egeria from they think she was from Tarragon, Spain, and she spent a year. She probably was a woman of means because she had a little entourage, and she spent a year on a pilgrimage doing all the Christian sites in the Mediterranean world. And she spent all of Lent and Easter in Jerusalem, which she was thrilled to do. But she started in Spain, went all the way around North Africa, across Europe. It's an amazing pilgrim diary. But she was writing to her women's community in Spain, so she's talking to the ladies. And in Jerusalem during Lent, the practice in the ancient church was Lent was when the catechumens had to go through spiritual exercises like fasting and education in a preparation in 6 weeks to be baptized, because they baptized everybody one day of the year, which was Saturday night before Easter Sunday. So she's there for this, and she's thrilled. She's reporting on all these things that are happening. And the last week of Lent is the most intense because the bishop gives the creed, and every day he gives a new line of the creed, and they have to learn the theology. They don't just recite the creed; they understand the creed. So the bishop is doing this instruction in the creed, and she's there to observe. And she writes this line, and the bishop gives the creed. And ladies, you would not believe the arguing with the bishop, even more than when he preaches in church. So if you read between the lines in that statement, the bishop had people arguing back with him to him in the sermon.
Wow.
They didn't just believe what they were told. And that model in Lent was they had to own it. So the arguing was they had to own it. It wasn't just told to them and they said, yes, sir. That was like, well, what do you mean by that? Or what, so the arguing back, when my friend and I wrote this book, Saving Paradise, we found that diary. We were like, oh my God, this is such a different model when we hear the word bishop.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But we have this idea that when the minister says it, it's the word, it's preaching of and the Protestants are worse at this than Catholics, right? We're so biblically trapped, as it were, in our heads around Scripture instead of really in our hearts. And so, in any case, the whole idea that the minister is some hallowed presence that shouldn't be challenged is really dysfunctional, I think, in an environment. And I'm sure there was authority. The bishop had a lot of authority and power, but it wasn't to tell people what they had to believe.
Yeah.
And of course, in the ancient church, the arguing about theology was something they didn't like in coffee shops and whatever what
Right,
we would
our
think of.
equivalent,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. I mean, they lynched. They was serious. They lynched bishops that they didn't agree with. I mean, people got killed over these theological arguments. So it was very intense.
Mm-hmm.
But people actually had an opinion. So I don't know. I wouldn't recommend violence.
The lynching part.
Yeah, no, not that part. But the idea. This is, I think, the problem with a lot of the ways that the church works is we believe that it's belief that unites us.
Right.
And I do not believe that belief. I mean, my opinions change all the time.
Well, let's stay on this because the other half of this, again, the conference is seeking wisdom and understanding.
Yes.
So like you said, I think especially Protestantism has been around. I mean, not our denomination. Shout out to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Well,
No creed but
we're
Christ.
like, you believe whatever you want to
Right.
believe, but you read the Bible with some discernment, right?
But there has been that, like, this idea that what unites us is, at least broadly speaking, in Protestantism, is like adherence to a certain set of beliefs, especially most recently, in the last century or in American Christianity. How do we change that to a more allowance for understanding?
I think where this is, in retrospect, I think where Protestantism failed to understand human behavior was the debates were around the Eucharist. The Eucharist was the flashpoint for the Protestant Reformation because of the transubstantiation and what was the meaning of the body on the table. That was true in ancient Christianity or in medieval Christianity as well. And it focused on what you believed was happening in the Eucharist.
Right.
I think the reason it was a flashpoint is it's ritual that matters so much.
Right.
And the Protestants, rather than figure out how to do ritual that worked, they gave it up.
Yeah.
I heard it over and over in the lecture this afternoon about the biblical texts from the prophets where they say, I hate your rituals and I blah, blah. As a very Protestant bias to select those texts, right? And I think it's meant that we are very thin and weak on ritual. It's even the ritual becomes an expression of a particular person's belief system rather than being a kind of what we know. For example, in any other form of collective work, you have to train people so that stuff is automatic in their body.
Yes.
And if they don't get it automatic in their bodies, you can't tell an athlete, how to do something, and then they do it.
You don't want them thinking during a game. You want them
acting, right? So you drill.
Right.
But behind that is a commitment to the sport, a commitment to doing well.
Right.
And ritual is like that. It's not meant to be every week you change the words of something so people will think about it again in a new way.
Right.
You just do the same thing over and over again. And you recite the same. Everybody's got to memorize. You don't have to read, and you don't be looking down. You're looking at each other, right, and connecting. And so it's actually the automatic behavior of the recitation that delivers the meaning, not thinking about the meaning.
Yes.
Right? It's an embodied practice, and Protestants are really lousy at that.
Yeah.
It's like changing the language. You can't do anything by memorization. So it's not trained into you. You have to redo it every week to think about. And that's a very weak way to create a community.
I love this point because I'm thinking of an interview I did. It'll be coming out before yours with David Taylor. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Can't remember. I think he's out of Fuller, but he has a book on the body and worship and talking about how the importance of physicality in worship and how the physicality, of course, I'm thinking shout out to our denomination, the weekly practice of communion, and how, if I'm understanding you correct, right, it's not the words we're saying that is really making the impact. It's the action that is teaching lessons to us.
Yeah, and it's sort of random because it's so non-formalized,
Right.
right?
Right.
So you never know when you show up in a disciple church what you're going to be served and how you're going to get it. Because we don't have standard ways we really do things.
Right.
And I actually am much more interested in things like the Common Book of Prayer. And of course you have problems inclusifying and adding trans and all those.
Right.
But so there's those kind of language adjustments, but really, I've been in several Protestant churches for the prayer time, and then let us pray as Jesus taught us to pray. And then you can't recite the Lord's Prayer from memory because they've got a whole paragraph that's an interpretation of it that you have to read out loud together.
So again, the point is not the words, so to speak. It's the action of saying it together. Hearing it.
Yeah.
Hearing it.
Yeah. It's like the way I've been profoundly moved occasionally. Well, I was at a memorial service, and now I can't even remember who it was for, but it was interfaith. It wasn't one tradition. And I remember a rabbi getting up and saying, "Will you say the words with me?" He said, and he just started this 23rd Psalm, and everybody knew how to say it. And it was like, we're so powerful. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He make it. And that's like, if there's two things that everybody in Christianity has memorized, is the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm.
Yeah. And
right?
Probably maybe Amazing Grace too.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially Protestants, right? Yeah. Methodists and Protestants. But really there's almost nothing else. And for sure the Lord's Prayer. Sure the Lord's Prayer. So now I've been in these Protestant services where you have to read the Lord's Prayer because it's not the one you know.
Right.
Right. And so it's still just words, right? But there's something about the way the ritual itself, the memorized words, the gestures load all the meaning in you need.
Yes.
So there's a wonderful book by Tanya Lohrmann called How God Becomes Real.
Okay.
She's not a particular. She grew up Unitarian Universalist. So I don't think she's particularly religious herself now. I've met her and talked to her. And she is a participant anthropologist. So when she studies a religious group, she goes to the services and does the work. And for her doctoral thesis, she decided not to do the colonial anthropologist thing and pick an exotic group somewhere in a third world country and study them. She went to London and studied Druids. So she was there for a couple of months going to Druid ceremonies and being with Druids. And she said she woke up one morning. I think this is when she woke up. She looked out her bedroom window, just sort of when you wake up, and she looked and she saw a group of Druids. And she sort of blinked and looked again, and then they were gone. And she said, so she had been in these services for long enough that she was seeing things that she wouldn't have ever had before, and that she observes that it's the repetition of the ritual that makes that kind of putting in your body system possible.
See, this is my soapbox. That I think the best way to get kids to hold on to their faith in adulthood is simply bringing them to church regularly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember as a kid, I didn't understand the sermons really.
Right.
But I loved singing the hymns.
Yeah.
So I would sit down and I would put a marker in every page where the next hymn was so that I could open up right away and sing. And as an adult, I still do that. I still mark the hymnal for the next song. So because I can open it right away, and I don't like to look for it while the music's playing. But we the reason I think also that people don't come back to church as adults is that it's not in their body system, so they don't miss it.
Yeah.
Right. But if you grow up as a child, and you have to make the service child friendly, right? But if you grow up as a child in the service and not like in a play area separate from the service where you don't have to listen to it, but where you're sitting in a pew.
Yeah.
That it really gets in your body system in a very different way.
Yeah.
And you sort of miss it.
Boy, it's interesting because like whenever I'm stressed out driving, I'll turn on just piano hymns.
Yeah.
Because that's for me, I heard them so much, it just kind of just brings me down.
Yeah. And I love singing I'm just singing in my car. I sing hymns because it feels really good to sing, and they don't usually play them on the radio.
Right.
So, but yeah, and there's another really important work that really influenced me in this shift I've really made in the last 10 years around moral injury, because I think ritual is part of the recovery process, is a book called Ritual and Its Consequences. And it's written by a team of 5 authors in one voice. And there's like a Chinese historian of China and an anthropologist, and I mean it's a whole group of different kinds of scholars in different disciplines that make a case that ritual is how meaning is delivered.
Believe it.
And that we have an Enlightenment Protestant rationalist bias that thinks it's like ideas that matter, and they're looking at Confucian traditions and other traditions that are highly ritualized in terms of how they talk about ritual. And I think we've inherited the Protestant Enlightenment anti-ritual bias that's also deeply anti-Catholic. And I think it's cost us a lot, like our churches are failing.
And it's probably cost us some understanding.
That too. But I think that's part of the decline of Protestantism is there's not enough there to hold people.
Yeah.
And part of that is the anti-institutional world that we're living in based on failures of a lot of institutions. It's not just the wars and the government. But it's also religious institutions where they've had sexual abuse scandals. It's like the churches don't know how to pull people back together when those things blow up.
Right.
And
it's like
because there's not much else to hold.
Yeah, it's like we need a ritual to say, like, I can't remember where it came from, but I just got shipped a book, the cover talking about lament, and some people are trying to re-explore the tradition of lament in Christianity. But like exactly like that. Like we need a tradition, we need a ritual when things blow up to bring people together.
One of the most successful movements in the modern world has been Alcoholics Anonymous, right? It was the Oxford movement that created it used the ancient Christian penance system, which is a highly ritualized process. Highly formula. When you walk in, there's a formula for how you say everything. So you can go to an AA meeting anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And it's the same.
Yeah.
So it's highly successful.
Yeah.
Right? It may not keep people from drinking, but they drink, but they come back to it, right? Because they miss it.
Yeah.
And they make sure you have a person who, a sponsor, right? They have a whole system for supporting people going through this intense penance process that the higher powers really got. I mean, they've fixed it so you can attend and not have to be a Christian looking for penance, but they were studying, and in the ancient church, penance was not punishment; it was rehabilitation.
Yeah,
that was the whole point of it. So you were asked to do a particular discipline of praying and fasting. You had to come to church in plain clothes like sackcloth to show, but you didn't come alone. You were in the order of penitence. So there were big enough churches, so there were always multiple people going through penance, and you came to church and you were required to be there. Really, they expected you to come, and then you would go through the service of the word. But then, when it came to the Eucharist, that was reserved for baptized Christians. And so the catechumens and the penitents, because when you were a penitent, it was like you reverted to a pre-baptized state. And so you couldn't stay. But then when you were recommunicated, that's what excommunication meant. They didn't throw you out of the church. They threw you out of the Eucharist.
Interesting.
And we think it was like banishment, but no, it wasn't. It was rehabilitation. You couldn't be in the Eucharist if your soul wasn't okay. And if you were doing something serious enough to require a term of penance, then you needed to be rehabilitated so you could be back. They didn't want to lose you, but they also didn't want you there messing everything up. Like you arriving, as it were, drunk. Right. No, that would not be acceptable. So it was a very different sensibility about who could come to the Eucharist and why they couldn't be there. You catechumens, they hadn't been baptized, and penitents
Right.
reverted back. Anyway, it was highly ritualized processing, and it was a formal process. And the other thing was that if you were marked as in the order of the penitents, it was a responsibility, but everybody else in the church to support you to get better.
Yeah.
It wasn't about punishing you or shaming you, although there might have been some of the shame, and you have to confess what you did to the whole community, right? But then they would support you in getting better. That was the whole point of it.
How beautiful. Because I just think, like, when we think about our society, and we think about, again, our topic here of seeking wisdom and understanding in troubling times, like, my mind just bounces back and forth between so many issues that these rituals, these Christian traditions, inherently could solve, because we think about, like I'm thinking, like, cancel culture comes to mind.
Yeah.
Which is based on someone's wrongdoing, but then there needs to be some ritual to hold them accountable, but then to offer them acceptance back into the community with them making penance.
Yeah. And there was this is, I'm generalizing every region, and they were connected churches, but there were variations. But I think it was pretty understood that you could go through a serious process of penance once, and if you did it again, then you couldn't come back because you weren't fixable.
Yeah.
So there was a penalty, but then you just couldn't come to church. You just weren't part of the community anymore.
Right.
And for a lot of people, it was like, especially people who were poor, they got fed there.
Right.
Because once you joined and you were at the Eucharist table, they had a commitment that everybody would be taken care of in their community.
Yeah.
And John Chrysostom talks about how his church in Antioch fed, this is round numbers, but 3,000 widows, orphans, and sailors and poor people every day from their Eucharist.
Yeah.
3,000 people. What? Even if that's a broad number, 500 would be impressive,
so
right? It's impressive.
300 is incredible.
I know. And they just brought the food with the Eucharist wasn't a symbolic meal. It was actually a meal.
Yeah.
For some people, it's the only meal of their day.
Yeah.
So they made sure it was, and the list of foods is fun to look at. There's that 2nd century list of acceptable foods, and no meat, no red meat, because it was associated with blood sacrifice. Nothing that grew on the ground and touched the ground, because fertilizer is kind of dangerous. And no vegetables, they have to be cooked. So foods that didn't need to be cooked. And so any fruit that, like, of the vine, like a grape, a peach, an apple that hung, and most fruits were okay. And olives, cheese, milk, dairy, all of those were okay. Things that could be consumed right there. And of course, bread. So it's really interesting, just the list of what was okay to bring.
Yeah.
Because what are you going to do with a raw onion?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And mushrooms are very bad because they grow, in nasty places.
Yeah.
So yeah. And you could get a toadstool, right? So they had rules about it, but there were, and people stood. There were no chairs. And the services were 2 to 3 hours sometimes.
Yeah.
But there was processional. People were moving, and there was a lot of movement and chanting and stuff.
Yeah.
If you go to an Eastern Orthodox church, that's the closest kind of service to an ancient church practice that you'll find.
Yeah.
Because they didn't go the way the Western church did with crucifixion and crusades and awful things like that. The ancient church didn't believe that Jesus died for our sins. That whole ideology that God needs violence to save us was not an ancient church theology. Yeah. They really thought he had come in human form to teach us how to live, not how to die. So the first book in the Atonement by Anselm is Why God Became Human Was to Die.
Right.
Never mentions the resurrection or anything else much except that.
Yeah.
To die.
Yeah.
We didn't figure this out in Saving Paradise. There was another scholar who looked at that in relation to a lot of other things and realized that the idea that Jesus died for your sins is war propaganda for the Crusades.
Interesting. Well,
it emerges right in tandem with the Crusades.
That's wild to think about. Well, we got to save that for another time.
Okay.
How much? I don't know. We're at We're at 4:15 our time.
Oh, all right.
So no, do you need to leave?
Yeah, I probably ought to get my partner in crime here.
We're kind of just ad-libbing this. So
this is.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, I think the turn that Western Christianity made that has been the most difficult and destructive of human wisdom and flourishing is the theological turn to believing that we are broken and cannot be saved by and require the punishment to be visited upon Jesus of how depraved we are, and that whatever he did to save us is going to happen after we're dead. Right. So the Christianity,
there's no salvation in this life.
There is, but it's you wait for it.
Right.
Right. The church is a holding tank, as it were.
Right.
And that is not an ancient church theology. The ancient church believed that the church's destiny was to be the paradise in this world, and so that was what it meant to have human life flourish here. And so if you died, you just went to a new neighborhood of paradise. But you already had, at baptism, everything you ever needed for salvation. It was there. So that you could love the world.
Yeah.
Not say, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. Famous hymn.
Speaking of a good hymn.
Yeah, right. No, and of course, climate change. It's like, you have this conservative, God's just going to destroy it all anyway, so don't worry about it. Yeah. It's all part of the end times. So we're going to get a whole new heaven and earth. So it's very anti-flesh, anti-world, anti-creation, actually, right? I think that has allowed us to think we can just exploit things and use them and be indiscriminate about how we treat everything. And so now we're seeing in California the consequence of an otherworldly religion.
Yeah.
Peter Brown, who was a very famous early church historian at Princeton, he's sort of I don't know if he's still alive now, but he's done amazing work on antiquity and Christianity. His sort of magnum opus is one of these end of career books a famous scholar can do. It's 1,000-year history of rise of Western Christendom. And his flat out thesis in that book is early Christianity was a life affirming, this worldly, optimistic religion.
Yeah.
And that's why it succeeded.
Yeah. Offering people a better vision.
And a community that delivered it. It isn't even just a vision or a hope. It's a community that was responsible for delivering a decent life for people.
Right.
And the only difference between this world and the world of the dead is the death has a veil between the living and the dead, and Satan can't get through that veil.
Yeah.
So in the living world, creating paradise in the church requires being wise about evil and dealing with all the forces of death and destruction, as well as normal natural death and stuff. But then when you died, you could go and rest because Satan couldn't follow you there.
Yeah.
And then if you were rested, you could come back and visit the living and offer comfort and help. So they believed that the dead of the church arrived at every Eucharist first. Or Origen says that the dead arrived first, and the Eucharist table was hosted by the risen Christ. Every Eucharist, every feast, Jesus was there to host the table because he came back because the dead could come back to the living, right? So as our metaphor, my friend Rebecca and I in Saving Paradise, our metaphor for this is that you work your whole life in New York, you have a good life, but, there's bad weather and traffic and crappy things and crime. You have to deal with it. But basically you have a decent life and you raise your kids and you die, or not die, but then you retire and you go to a gated community in Florida. That's what it meant to die. You got to go to a gated community where it's really nice and you have to deal with all that stuff and you could relax and enjoy it. And you could visit your grandkids and your kids in New York if you wanted to.
Yeah.
It was more of what they thought about human life than death being a deadline, and once you crossed it, you were up or down and you couldn't come back and people couldn't visit you either.
Sure.
I mean, it's like there was and what's so silly about that idea is everywhere in the world people have visitations from the dead.
Right.
It's a common human experience. to see the dead. I had a visit from my mother.
Huh.
I mean, I am a science, I mean, it's like not,
Right.
I'm a modern person. I was just shocked when it happened. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew what happened when it was over. And when I tell my story about that, people come up to me afterwards and say, that happened to me too. And then they'll tell me their story.
Yeah.
So it's just a common occurrence. The only person in the ancient world that argued with that position that the dead could visit the living was Augustine. And he argued with it because his mother had never visited him.
Interesting. That's one interesting.
We could end with that. It's just very funny.
That's a fun one.
The credit I give Augustine, though, as a theologian, is he trusted his own experience to tell him things. His Confessions he really grounds a lot of his theological stuff in his own experience. And that's a feminist principle. Trust your experience.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, share how you're working now for the Volunteers of America.
Yes.
Share if folks want to connect with you, your book titles, anything like that.
Oh, okay. So my email is rbrock, simple RBROCK at V as in Victor, VOA.org. And that's my email. It's the fastest way to get to me. And my magnum opus is Saving Paradise. And I've made it a principle since I finished my doctoral thesis and published my doctoral thesis as a single authored book. I co-author with friends because I think the project is better and it's a lot more fun to write with a friend than it is to do it yourself alone. So all of my books after my dissertation were co-authored, and Saving Paradise is not the last. The Soul Repair book on moral injury is a different co-authored work, but the work I most love in terms of the theological perspective is Saving Paradise, and it's this. What does it mean that we can say the church is planted as a paradise in this world, and where that idea got trashed in Western Christianity with the Crusades and the wars, and then the colonization of the rest of the world. All of that is related to the loss, I think, of that. It isn't that there wasn't. I mean, I think it's an amazing thing that in a world where the Roman Empire oppressed people and salted the fields of their opponents when they defeated them, and the life expectancy was under 40 years old, and half of all infants died, and malaria and cholera. I mean, these normal diseases were just deadly.
Right.
And like 10% of the people lived beyond 50. In a world like that, they could say the church is planted as a paradise in this world. I think we could say that too.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time and your conversation.
Yeah.
Always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thank you. And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.